All right. Hello and welcome to the Time and Place, the gospel conversation show where we try to apply God's word to God's world. Solomon is not here, so I am Julian, and we're joined today by our friend Vacation Bible School. What's up, man?
Hello. Happy to be here. Thankful to be here. Thank you once again for having me on.
No problem.
Yeah, always enjoyed our conversations in the past.
Yeah, it was supposed to be last week, but the snowpocalypse happened, so we all got kind of internet stuck, so postponed it a little bit. Solomon's not here. He's home, kind of nursing some illness. So if you guys keep him in your prayers, we'd appreciate that. He's fine, but recovering. So keep him in mind. In the meantime, before we get started, I want to kind of talk about sort of current event. It's not political like it usually is, but still, I feel like it relates to the podcast quite a bit. The man, the myth, the legend that is Carmen passed away not too long ago, 2 weeks ago, I think he passed away, which I have not thought about Carmen in 10, 15, 20 years. And yeah, he's gone. So it was a shock to the entire, anybody who grew up in 90s Christianity. It was a jolt we felt.
Yeah, I don't know if many people had actually thought about Carmen within the last 10, 20 years. So, But yeah, that is it's crazy to try to explain. You were mentioning this before the show. It's crazy to try to explain who and what Carmen was to anyone that did not kind of go through that and experience him and have him in your life. It's very surreal.
I try to explain it to people imagine hearing a middle-aged Italian-American man rap unironically about Jesus, and you kind of can start to understand. But there was also a lot of he made movies, there were skits, he had very extensive makeup work in his music videos. It was a real production.
Yeah, it's crazy, over the top. He has that one video, I forget for which song it was, but where they're in hell and you have Satan, and it looks like it was taken out of the movie Legend with Tom Cruise and Tim Curry. It looks exactly like it. It's crazy.
He really did go all out on all of that stuff, and he might have been one of the first people to do a Christian movie that got theatrical release. He made that movie in 2000 where he played a retired boxer who was coming. It was basically Rocky Balboa, but 20 years earlier, and with Carmen as the lead actor. It was crazy. Yeah,
of course. It was inevitable that Christians made a knockoff version of Rocky. It was inevitable.
Well, the thing that was crazy about it too is that it got real theatrical release. It wasn't it wasn't like Left Behind where they gave you the VHS tape and they were called the theaters to make sure they played. It was on the listings. You could go to the movies and buy a ticket. Carmen was a force.
At one point, I think that, I don't know if this is still the case, but he held the record for largest Christian concert of all time.
Oh, I could believe that.
At one point, yeah. And it's Carmen did that. It wasn't Hillsong, or it wasn't, Chris Tomlin or something, someone like that you would expect. Carmen held the record for that. And it's crazy because so many people now don't even know who he is.
Yeah, he was in that golden age of I don't know if he was pre-CCM, but he was at the peak of CCM. He met that convergence point before it went mainstream, and it was kind of coming out of that 70s, 80s Christian wave. He kind of did have the ability to cross denominations, though. That's what I thought was interesting, because my whole family was super Southern Baptist, hardcore Southern Baptist. Don't drink, don't smoke, don't dance. And Carmen's very Pentecostal. He's super, super charismatic, and still they would pack the concerts with everybody. It didn't seem like any of that mattered. It was just it's Carmen. We're going to go see Carmen.
Yeah. It's really interesting. He still holds the record. Thank you for checking me. I appreciate that. That's great. Yeah. It's nuts to me. Admittedly, I'm not the biggest Carmen fan myself. Though I do love him in a type of ironic way, because I find him so campy and entertaining from that respect. And what's interesting to me is after I learned about his recent passing, I went back and listened to some of his music. And if you listen to just like the instrumental part, at least in some of his albums, I'm not saying this for all of it, if you listen to just the instrumental part of it, and you think about the actual progression of notes that he's singing within the melody, it's not bad.
Yeah, no, he's a very
I was
good
listening
singer.
I was like, this is actually decent. It's just his performance of it is over the top campy that like I can't take his just how campy his singing is. It sounds like he's, playing some sort of different character, which I think is part of maybe the appeal that some people had to him. But it's still like, if this was a different, singer, if you handed this to, I don't know, Andre Crouch or something, some like really good, respected, talented singer, they would knock it out of the park. And so that's what's fascinating to me.
He kind of was like almost like a Wayne Newton, or like, it was like a Vegas stage show, like a Christian Vegas stage show. When you
exactly. Absolutely.
So, he'll be missed for a lot of different reasons. I do have, Carmen's one of those things like Salty or like,
yes,
any of those things that from my childhood that I'm like, yeah, it was goofy, but like it was a part of my life for a long period. So
of course,
I have some, he's like your dad. Like he's not cool, but you love him. Like he's trying. I don't know if you ever listen to the Babylon Bee podcast, but
I do not know.
One of the things is they interview everybody. They've had all kinds of people on, but whenever they have like a Christian celebrity on, their question is always like, have you ever met Carmen? And they just want like Carmen stories. And my favorite one was Doug TeNapel, who he's the creator of Earthworm Jim. He's worked on some stuff like that. He used to do album covers for Five Iron Frenzy. So,
oh wow,
yeah, he's big in the media world. Like he's done multiple video games. He's had cartoons that he produced on Nickelodeon and stuff. Somebody else that he didn't want to name had been on tour with Carmen, and they did say that he had a tanning bed on his touring bus. So that was enough for me.
Of course he did. Of course, like that story is 100% true. I don't need to fact check that. I know in my heart that's absolutely true.
He had to keep that glow, man. He was kind of a heartthrob.
Yep.
So rest in peace, Carmen. You will be missed. So today's subject is a little serious. It can get a little serious. I think we like to have fun with everything, but it can be a little heavy sometimes. So before we get started, you wanted to say a couple words?
Yeah. Just to give, we're talking about purity culture tonight, and we are aware of the negative impact that it has had on so many people, especially people who are victims of a variety of forms of sexual trauma. And so we just wanted to, acknowledge that at the beginning, give a bit of a trigger warning, if you will, to let you know if you're just not in an emotional space tonight to listen to this kind of conversation. Of course, we're going to be very respectful and sympathetic, to your pain and take it seriously. But, if you're not in an emotional space to listen to that right now, that's perfectly okay. You're welcome to come back at a later time. We will be here virtually waiting for you, welcoming you once again with open arms.
Right. And, we try not to be flippant about serious things. And I think one of the things with purity culture is it is kind of a joke, right? Especially to the bigger world. It's like it's a joke thing. It's like that weird thing that Christians do. But
I was just in the mall yesterday for like the first time in a year. I was like, I just got to get out of the house and go someplace. And I went into Zoomies.
Oh, yeah, you did.
They sell like Virginity Rocks t-shirts, which is a parody of like purity culture type stuff. So yeah, it has now been appropriated as a complete joke in secular culture.
And it's one of those things that I don't think we, me personally, in a way, I remember it, but I'm just now seeing the ramifications of it kind of bear themselves out. And I think, I grew up Southern Baptist. I did look up the history of like the True Love Waits movement, and it was a Southern Baptist movement. Like it came through the Southern Baptist Church, got picked up by Lifeway, who still sponsors it. Apparently it's still a thing. I didn't know it was still going on. So what was your background with the movement itself? Was that like a church thing for you?
Yes. So for me personally, I did grow up very much entrenched in purity culture, though interestingly, and this is what I've heard from a couple other people as well. I know this wasn't the case for everyone. My parents were not into it. My parents were not like these full-hearted supporters of purity culture, and they never made me read I Kissed Dating Goodbye. They explicitly told me that they disagreed with I Kissed Dating Goodbye and stuff like that. So not that they didn't care about,
Right.
They're very dedicated Christians and everything, but just the whole like purity culture bent on it, they disagreed with.
Right.
But I went to a private Christian school from third grade until graduation, and I was actively involved in these type of Southern Baptist youth groups, and I got a lot of it from them. And admittedly, this is after the era of where I Kissed Dating Goodbye, because I'm a little bit younger, so this was like mid 2000s, early 2010s. And so I Kissed Dating Goodbye and True Love Waits kind of died out. And in terms of, they were not as explicit in their ideology anymore.
Okay.
But they still kept a lot of the themes. It's just they weren't, they kind of toned it down a little bit. But then they also ramped up their emphasis on like anti-porn type of teaching and things like that, because the internet was really becoming popular.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was coming up in it kind of I graduated in 2007. So I graduated high school the same year like YouTube went live. So internet porn wasn't really a thing when I was coming up in high school. So yeah, it was about dating and all of that kind of stuff. And it's just a weird way to look at it, I guess, now, especially thinking back on it, like especially now knowing the author of I Kissed Dating Goodbye, not only like disowns the book, but disowns the faith. Like he's not even in any church anymore. He's like, I don't know. I don't believe this. I don't believe anything. I have left my wife. I don't know what I'm doing. So,
Should we perhaps, for anyone that doesn't know, define purity culture for people?
Sure. That's a good idea. It's kind of hard to define. And that's one of the reasons that I was so confused by it, because it's, my assumption, just because of the title, is true love waits. Okay. The implication is that you're waiting until you're married to have sex. That's what I assumed was the rationale behind it. I looked it up because I was trying to find some history on it, and they talked to the one of the founders. His name was Richard Ross, and this was a quote they got from him. True love, meaning a life of purity, waits until one approaches the throne at the end of life on earth. There, a Christ follower presents a gleaming gift to His Highness, a gift of a lifetime of sexual purity in mind and body. So I guess it's like shooting beyond marriage, and said it. I got uncomfortable reading the quote.
I think so sexual purity, and I think in that case would be sex only expressed within the confines of marriage,
right?
Between a husband and wife, until they die,
right?
But I personally think it's important to point out, in terms of practice, if you look beyond kind of what these people say in their nice quotes to sell books and everything, if you look in terms of its actual practice and how the ideology, because I do think it's like an ideology in a sense of how it gets implemented to people. It's not about abstinence before marriage. It is about complete and total sexual repression before marriage. It is the goal is a type of sexless existence in a sense. Like it is this sexual motive repression, and it's not motivated by like cultivating desires towards maybe like a more properly ordered life, or reordering your sex is going to be down towards the end of the totem pole. I'm going to put other more important things at the top. It's not about that. It's motivated by like a type of prosperity gospel, of this promise that like, if you are completely sexless, you don't have any sort of sexual thoughts, and if you don't, do anything sexual before marriage, then you will have the perfect marriage, the perfect sex life.
Yes.
And it's like this weird promise that's what's going to happen for you. And I think it's also built a lot on self-hatred as well, as it gets people to be completely ashamed of their own bodies, their own sexuality. By that, I mean just like a general, kind of sexual disposition towards the world, that perceives things, in terms of, romance and beauty and being attracted to other people. It gets people to be ingrained in a complete self-hatred and shame regarding all of those things in all of their kinds of expression.
Right. That's, it is weird because that attitude is, I feel like it's recent. Me and Solomon have talked about how off podcast before, how Martin Luther, during the time that he was, kind of deconstructing the Catholic idea of marriage and celibacy, that you weren't considered married until you had sex. You actually had to have sex before the ceremony, and somebody had to watch you to verify that this happened. And
they had some messed up practice.
Yeah, it was a very different attitude towards sex. But in the modern kind of American evangelical church, sex is almost like a thing we have to like put up with. Like, oh, I wish we didn't have to do this, but it's here, so this is what it is.
Right. It's trying to, like just repress it in a very unhealthy way, to like relegate it to such a hidden part of one's, mind, or hidden part of one's kind of church community, that you can never talk about these things unless it's, under the rubric of purity culture and things like that.
It's really strange, because as much emphasis as like the Bible puts on marriage and union and family and children, like none of that happens without sex. But for some reason, we're like, well, this is like the thing that you have to do to get to the good stuff. This is the bad part of it. I explicitly remember this one time. My parents had bought, I had cousins that were about the same age as me, and they had bought I guess it was like a mini devotional for us all that we all had. And it was like, here, read it. It was from Family Christian Stores, where you get all your good Christian needs when it existed.
Are they even? Yeah,
no, it's gone. It is gone. Yeah. The only one that's surviving is Lifeway. No, it's okay. The only one that survives is Lifeway, and the only reason they survive is because they're the publishing arm of the Southern Baptist Convention. If it wasn't for that, they would not exist. But that's why they're still around. So we got these books, and I remember reading a piece of it that was on purity and sexuality. And one of the statements that like stuck out to me really, really bluntly, and it still is like the only part of this book that I remember, is that it said, all sex is sin. So how do we deal with that? And I was like, well, I don't know. How do we deal with that? Because that's a very strange way to, and I guess their rationale, their approach was the verse where it says that my mother conceived me in sin, had to do with the fact like, well, the method of conception is sex, so therefore your sex was a sin. Which is so confusing to anybody who's 12 and doesn't know, like, I don't know how to deal with that.
Right. Yeah, that's crazy. Admittedly, that was not my particular education, or miseducation, I would say. But ours was more of like, it was this, again, like very much a prosperity gospel motivation of, if you just wait and put it off long enough, you are going to have the perfect sex life. Is just going to be completely perfect, flawless, and because, it's God's promise to you. And so, of course, it's going to be the best thing ever.
I don't think it was intentional either. Like, I don't think my parents were like, oh, this is all 100% on board. I think they just got it at Family Christian Stores. So they assumed it was
of course,
on the level,
not malicious. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And so I like what you're talking about, because that's the angle I kind of came at this at, looking at it now. And I feel like for the most part, that idea, that prosperity of like, save yourself and you'll have this perfect marriage, didn't stick with the guys that I was in youth group with. That idea kind of faded away from we growing up and getting older, we kind of shed that idea. I don't know why, but that idea of like, well, if you act good, God will give you good stuff, just kind of died out for us. Maybe just stuff we've been through in life. Or for me personally, it was when I found out I was diabetic. I was like, well, I guess it doesn't quite work that way, does it? So, but what I have seen is kind of girls that were in my age group and were in, youth group, struggle with dating and now marriage in that way. Where it was like, I was told if I kept my purity, which I feel like is a code word for holiness, and I really don't like that it's used that way.
Right.
If I kept my holiness, then God would give me the husband that fulfills me and completes me and understands me, and my my marriage will be everything that I've dreamed it was. And they're holding out for this prince that doesn't exist. I was telling my fiance about it, like, all of these people believe this idea, and then they get me. Like, this is not the prince that they sign up for. It's a real human with flaws and selfishness. And
Yeah, I think that's totally the case. Definitely misrepresents expectations. And I do think it should be pointed out that it seems on the whole, more women were affected negatively by purity culture than men. Though there were lots of men who were negatively affected, myself included. I've had to deconstruct a lot of the narratives of purity culture. Actually working with a therapist even on deconstructing some of the things that I taught because it so negatively affected me. And it seemed to have a real negative effect on people that unfortunately took it the most seriously. So if you like really bought into and trusted the people who were teaching this to you, which were often pastors, youth pastors, Bible teachers, people that you looked up to and respected and trusted, if you really took it seriously, and motivated out of wanting to do what God wants you to do, it ends up affecting these people the most, unfortunately.
And it's really sad because it's one of those things. It's almost like when you talk to somebody who maybe has come out of a cult, who they're motivated by sincerity. Like, I thought this was true, and I thought I was doing what God wanted me to do.
Exactly.
And all I have is wreckage and damage left behind me.
Right. It's the exact thing.
It's really sad. And I guess it's kind of fallen apart recently because some of the bigger, proponents of it are falling out. Like, they're not a part of it anymore. So the foundation that they built is like, well, we have to abandon it, I guess. But the ramifications for people our age is just, we don't know how to have relationships. We don't know how to we don't know how to talk to our children who are going to be coming up about this kind of stuff because no one talked to us about it in a way that makes any sense.
Right. Yeah. I'm still feel like I'm floundering in this area of my life, just trying to figure out like what the heck I think about these things. And, I'm trying to, just be able to talk to women. Like, I know that's like, but to be able to talk to women without feeling, guilty, just to have a normal, healthy, friendship with another woman, not even a romantic setting, still can sometimes be very difficult for me. And which is sad, because a lot of times in purity culture, it would just be like, you gotta separate boys and girls as much as possible, keep them away from each other. Cause, if you leave them, together, then it's, they're going to be too tempted and they won't be able to control themselves and all that kind of stuff, which is silly. And it's sad too, because I have some incredible women in my life that are just these incredible people that I so cherish. And I would not be the man that I am today without these female friends in my life. And we're not romantically involved with each other. They're my friends. And it's sad that purity culture, I think, kept that away from a lot of people.
It does kind of turns people into temptation objects, I guess.
Exactly. Yes. And that was one of the main, perhaps we can unpack that further, because I think that was a huge problem of purity culture, was the distortion of people's perception, like you said, to view them purely as like temptation objects. And it got applied to men and women in slightly different ways, different narratives, but it definitely messed both of these groups up. Again, if they took it seriously.
Right. Which, you always had the kids at youth group that would kind of sneak off, like the couple that would disappear and everybody knew what they were doing, but you couldn't find them anywhere.
Right.
But yeah, it does affect people differently. And I think because, we talked to Doug Wilson about this, and he said before, like, modern culture wants to have a male and female sexual attitude that's exactly the same. Like, why do men have to be so sexually oriented? Why do they have to be so sexual as beings? And he's like, well, because the sky is blue and water is wet. Like, that's just the way it is. So we do have different kind of attitudes and responses and even desires sexually as males and females. So it does kind of show up differently. In my personal experience, it felt like the burden was on the man, on the boys. I shouldn't even say man, on the young boys who were trying to figure all this stuff out. It was, you're full of evil desires. And it's just that put it in your head. You're full of evil desires. And, as a Calvinist, I would agree with them, but in a different way. I wouldn't put it that way.
We're not talking about like depravity or like the general, sinfulness of humans.
Just your attraction to females, it's bad.
Right.
On women, it was the other way. It was like, you are a problem for them. You make them sin. Yeah. And so it's just this unhealthy attitude towards each other, that like, you're a problem for me, and like, oh, I think I am a problem for you. So how do we handle this? How do we do it? And you don't know. You really don't. And
exactly.
The alternative, which is also unhealthy, and I think we've talked about this before with Christian culture, is that whatever the secular culture does, we swing hard to the right. The alternative in secular culture is, well, there are no rules. It's all whatever you want to do. Sexuality is just fun. The apostle puts it as, the stomach for food and food for the stomach. That's the idea, is like, you're built to have sex, so have sex and have as much of it as you want. And, the hard part growing up with both of those things on both sides of you is like, okay, what's correct? Like, what's the biblical ethic on sexuality? Which is, for us, especially as Reformed people, we always come back to, or for us being me and Solomon, I should say, as Reformed people, coming back to, actually, this might be interesting because I don't know where you stand on like the solas and everything. As Reformed people, is always like, okay, well, what does the text actually say about this? Because that's going to be the standard, not some guy's opinion or a book that this person wrote or somebody's personal testimony or whatever. It's like, what does the text say about sexuality and how we conduct ourselves and how we live and how we do things? So yeah, I mean, you're more educated than me on stuff like this. So what's your kind of take on that? Like, what does the scripture say about sexuality and relationships and things like that?
That's a good question. And I'm going to try to problematize it simply because, I do want to point out that it is very difficult, I think, to construct a type of like one-to-one correspondence between what the biblical texts are saying about sexuality and like what we should be doing in our own context. I'm not trying to say that the Bible's not authoritative or that the Bible has nothing to say to us today. I'm just saying that like what's difficult is that the Bible is writing to people in a particular context, dealing with particular social situations. And so there is some motivation in addressing the type of material because marriage back in that time, marriage involves lots of things. Of course, it involves, sex. Yes. But it also involves lots of politics, lots of socioeconomic factors, and things like that. And the sociology of marriage in, first century New Testament times is almost completely different than our own sociological conditions. We don't have arranged marriages anymore. Inheritance isn't determined through, legitimacy of the firstborn son. And, women aren't sold with dowry to these arrangements that are, so all of those things I think are different. Not to say that you can't learn anything about sex from the Bible. It's just like, that is one of the things that I think makes it so difficult for people now trying to figure out, like, what do we do? It's like, okay, well, how do we handle some of the cultural differences? How do we translate some of these principles to our own time today? But I do think that there's, some general things that one can conclude, because I think it's also, and maybe this is where we're different. Because I approach it. I'm a Methodist, and so I approach it from like the Methodist tradition, which has something called the Wesleyan Quadrilateral, which is that you kind of have these different influences of authority, if you will, within like navigating questions of faith. It's more of like, these are the tools that you need to use that are important and that are, we might say, authoritative for in interacting with questions of faith. And that would be scripture primarily, but also tradition. So looking at like how is the history of the Christian church interacted with this?
Right,
what are some of the great thinkers and, your denomination and things like that said about it, as well as reason. So, think about it critically and apply proper critical thinking tools to this question, and then personal experience as well. Like, what have you learned from your own life that might influence your understanding of this? So those 4 factors, I think, need to be involved in what as well. So whenever I think about, I'm taking up too much time. I don't know.
It's actually really interesting. I like that because I don't know. I don't know a lot about the Methodist denomination.
That's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. It's one. Who
really does.
Right. It's like Episcopalianism. I don't know a lot about that either. Anglicanism. I don't know. Like, there's some denominations that are just not prevalent in South Texas, so I don't know a lot about them.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting because we would come at it kind of in this, because anytime we have discussions about this stuff, we're like, okay, well, what do we think about this? Well, this church father said this, or this reformer said this, and they held this opinion, and they held this opinion, or, let me ask my pastor and see what he thinks. You ask yours and see what he thinks. So it's kind of, we apply that, but we come back to the text. Okay, all of that, how does it line up with the text? What does the text say? And of course, context, critical thinking. Right now in our church group, we're going through Revelation, so context is a big thing that we're trying to hammer home. Like context. Yes. Personally, I as far as the marriage and sexuality thing, it comes back to Matthew 19. I feel like a lot of people think, especially with sexuality, it's hard to get a beat on it because, like, well, Jesus didn't talk about it a ton. He talked about, love for neighbor and not being a hypocrite and sacrifice and mercy and kindness and all of that. But the one text that does stick out in that was in Matthew 19, where he talks about divorce. And the Sadducees ask him what his opinion is on it. Should we, Moses allowed us to get divorced for any reason at all. What do you say? And the cultural context is there was 2 schools of rabbinical thought that had 2 different opinions about divorce at the time. And so they were basically asking him, where do you fall? What's your opinion on this? And, his, which I think this is kind of why, 5 solas, his appeal is to the text. And he goes, have you not read? And his answer is, have you not read that in the beginning, he who made them male and female. And for this reason, a man leaves his family and cleaves to his wife, and the 2 become one flesh. So for me, and I think for a lot of Reformed people, I would say most, if not all, that's kind of our baseline foundation as far as a sexual ethic. Like, we're designed inherently to be united sexual beings in a marriage context, right? So,
I think that's a pretty good starting point of just saying, like, this is part of what it is to be human. This is part of who we are. It's part of our being. And I think that what you're latching onto is somewhat of my position as well, which is pointing out that it's kind of like, all right, these people are sexed beings, beings who have sexuality and sex.
Right.
And then it's the question of, like, okay, how does that get properly oriented and expressed? And I think what's interesting is if you look at, like, what purity culture taught people, maybe I'll use that as a foil and say, like, okay, now how can we do something different? They would just tell them, just repress everything. You're this, sexual being, but just turn the switch off until you're like 24, and then, turn it back on and you'll realize, and it'll be perfect. Or it was, even sometimes more threatening situations of, like, don't have sex, or, you'll be a lot of horrible narratives centered around, damaged goods. We can get back to all the different analogies and everything, but you are damaged goods, or, this is a gift that you've ruined, and all that kind of stuff. And so purity culture ended up presenting the end, the final goal, the telos, to use the philosophical term, of sexuality as a type of prosperity gospel, as we said before, that the perfect marriage, it's this perfect marriage and sex life. And the habit that they propose to reach that goal is just complete and total repression of one sexual being. So again, it's almost ludicrous. But I think that instead, we need to have a final goal of marriage or sex that is something more like the cultivation of a life that builds one another in mutual love, in friendship, and a virtuous character that is in service to the kingdom of God.
Right.
I don't mean like everyone has to be, part of a church, but I do think, this idea of having a partner with you that enables you to, to be more service to the kingdom of God than what you would be able to do on your own. Right. To have your sexuality, with this goal of fostering and growing a love and a friendship and developing in Christian character virtues, I think should be probably what I would say is the telos of marriage.
It's interesting too when you talk about the damaged goods idea, because it's funny when you think about like, you'll have a perfect marriage. What's the requirement? That you be a perfect person, right? You have to be unspoiled. You have to be spotless. You have to present the best to this person so that your marriage will be perfect. And it does that,
right.
That sense of guilt, like I'm not perfect, right? It's almost like a dread. I remember, when I was in my 20s, kind of a dread of like having these conversations with girls at church. If it ever came up, it was like, I have to tell them like, I'm not this pure,
Oh, of course. Yes. It's so many, I've been there as well. It's, but I followed the rules pretty seriously, but there would still always be this thing, like, I lusted after that Victoria's Secret one time when I was 14, and not that I condone that, but it's still like, it would cause me, but I think it's a good illustration because it would be these things that are like, okay, not good, but it's also like, I'm not this sex demon,
right?
But it's like it would cause me to view myself that way, and I would,
right.
Something like, Lord have mercy, lusting after a Victoria's Secret's ad or whatever. Whenever I was 14, and, that would happen, and then I would be terrified that I was like becoming addicted to pornography or something like that, and it would be, take an influence on like if I got into a relationship or something, I would feel so guilty, like I was, this flawed, person that couldn't meet the standards, and I failed them in some sense. And, you almost have to like confess,
right.
That turns out I'm not perfect.
Well, and I can't imagine that kind of purity, like thinking purity culture now, like in today's situation, like in a world where leggings exist, I can't imagine like trying to be that like perfect, I never lust after anything, I never look at any, like the hypersexualized culture we have now. It would be, you'd almost have to be a monk to live that way. What's
interesting is that there's recent work done by, I don't agree with everything that she says. Some of it I think is a little bit problematic, but Sheila Gregory has done a lot of work on deconstructing purity culture and some of the harmful myths. And she makes a really interesting argument that purity culture creates lust. And what she means by that is because it had such a negative understanding of male sexuality, because it's feminine sexuality as well. But in terms of the lust conversation, for male sexuality, it was that all attraction to other people is lust and you can't control it. You are, you must hide yourself. You have to, bunker up, cover your eyes at all time, because you are basically a sex demon. You are a monster. And if you think that someone is beautiful, you've committed a sin. You've lusted after them, and you're, and it reinforces this narrative of like, you have no real love to give. And there's no possibility of you presenting any real romantic love, any real sexual love within, a relationship and things like that. And it teaches men that every time that they see a person who's beautiful, there's lots of, I would argue along with Andy Warhol, that if everybody's not a beauty, then no one is. I think everyone's beautiful. And so whenever you see all these beautiful people that are out in the world and you go, oh, wow, that person's really, really beautiful. They're very, attractive. And your mind immediately interprets that as like lust, sin. What are you doing? You were sexualizing them. It creates tons of anxiety, and it causes one to think that like, oh my gosh, I struggle with lust all the time, because it it's almost like a don't think about pink elephants type of situation.
Right.
And so it ends up creating lust in that sense.
That's interesting. That's really interesting because that gets into a broader topic. I really like that. I don't think we think about this often, but that ethics and aesthetics are kind of philosophically linked. Like when we talk about what is good. So, those two things are connected, but we don't think about that a lot. And I feel like the church doesn't really have like an understanding of aesthetics or beauty that kind of lets us appreciate beautiful things in a non-sexual way. Like you're saying, like if you see a person, you just think they're beautiful. And especially, I think it kind of feeds into like this, it's kind of a weird side tangent, but like even to an emotionalism, right? Like you can't be, one of the things that really bothers me, and however you feel about it, when Captain America, the movie was coming out, and I know it's going to sound weird, but I'm going somewhere with this. Trust me.
No. I trust you. Yeah.
When he had Bucky, his best friend, there was this thing floating around the internet, maybe just because the internet is weird and they sexualize everything, but it was this idea that like, oh, they're a couple. And it's like, well, why are they a couple? Because they have a close friendship, and that's not masculine, I guess. So there's this weird idea in kind of Western masculinity, but also in just the church culture that like emotionalism is sexual or strong feelings of any kind is sexual. So it's, you have people that don't know how to build friendships at all or relationships at all, even
which goes back to what, amongst the same gender. It goes back to like what I was saying before about like the constant trying to separate boys and girls from one another and, preventing any sort of cross-gender, friendships and things like that. Yeah, this reinforces this narrative of like emotional connection is somehow the same thing as sexual attraction. Now, it's not that sexual attraction is devoid of emotional attraction or emotional connection. I'm not saying that, but it is like, not
it's
all
not a one-to-one correlation.
Yeah.
And it's just another angle on that too is in this need to be physically pure is that you're kind of cavalier with your emotions. I don't know if it's a way to make up for it or a way to whatever, but I knew a lot of people in high school that were dating as if they were married, but it was celibate,
Yeah.
And it's like you get into these weird spots where it's like, oh, we pray together and we study the Bible together and we have deep conversations together. It's like, you're not married. Like you're emotionally bonded. So you have all these celibate.
Lord have mercy, but I've been guilty of that as well. Definitely.
Right.
And it's part of that upbringing that I don't, still trying to unlearn some of that, but yeah.
And, I think in some ways, if not more, it's as damaging as like an unhealthy sexual ethic is an unhealthy emotional ethic where you're just bonding yourself that deeply to every person you date. Like you're just having celibate marriages your whole life. And then that the breakup is so spectacular and damaging. Like, well, yeah, because you've basically been practicing your marriage with this person for, however many years it is.
Yeah. There's no sense of balance to it.
Right.
But these people, I was never, was not taught to learn how to balance those things.
Right. And, I remember my dad telling me, I had to have been in high school and I don't even know how the conversation came up about, dating or whatever. And my dad he's in his 50s now. He was born in 1963. So, he had kind of an older understanding of like dating and dating was casual. You just go on dates and there's no expectation of anything and there's no promise of anything. We're just hanging out. We're having fun. We're seeing if we like each other. And if we do, then we can be more serious. So that was his attitude. And he was like, well, you should be, dating lots of people and just, it's casual. There's nothing serious. You're just hanging out. And to me in my, early 2000s dating understanding, I was like, what do you mean dating lots of people? That's so immoral and improper.
Yeah.
The older I got, I was like, oh, he had a point. He was right about it. It's way less serious that way.
Exactly. Yeah. It's difficult to pull that off though in today's day and age.
Right.
You just have to be like, I have, these are just friends and we're hanging out. You can't say dating anymore. Yeah. But yeah, that is really true of like just again, this kind of all or nothing, not learning how to have balance, not learning how to perceive nuance, just complete black and white thinking in the most extreme sense about a topic that is very difficult. What could be more difficult than like relationships and romance and love and sexuality? Like all of that stuff is so messy and so difficult. It's beautiful. It's absolutely worth engaging in, but it's hard.
And there's, this is interesting. This purity culture says dating is practice for divorce.
I remember hearing that.
Did you hear that? I never heard that before. That's a new one for me.
That was kind of died out during my time, so that wasn't like what was taught about it. But I did hear those quotes, and it was like if you get into certain material that was still in the church library or what have you, then you might come across it. Yeah.
I wrote this down too because I thought it was so strange. The True Love Waits pledge. I never did that. Like I guess we never did the full program.
I never did it either. I went to a youth group and I showed up I started at a youth group right after they did like a purity ring pledge.
You're the only one.
So I missed it. Yeah, I know. I'm the only one. So I guess scarlet letter on me or something.
So there was a whole pledge. You would sign a card, and I like reading this because it's so weighty when you're 12 years old. I can't imagine.
Yeah.
So it says, believing that true love waits, I make a commitment to God, myself, my family, my friends, my future mate, and my future children to be sexually abstinent from this day until the day I enter a biblical marriage relationship. So the weight of all future generations of your family is resting on your ability to keep yourself under control. So, no pressure.
Yeah, there's so much pressure on that. And one of the things this was at least my experience. I can't speak for anyone else, but it very much relates to what you're talking about on like future generations or holding on this, is that purity culture developed this notion of the future spouse. Now, I mean, everyone has some notion, but they really use this a lot, and constantly using this notion of the future spouse in order to shame you into certain kinds of if you're on a date, they would sometimes be like, you just need to ask yourself, would I be doing what I'm doing if my future spouse was in the room right now? And it's like, okay, this is weird. To definitely go a direction that admittedly no one should ever go. There's a French philosopher and psychoanalyst called Jacques Lacan, which is always just a way to kill a conversation, or an interesting way to start on a first date. Who knows? But he had this theory that's really interesting called, I think it's the ego ideal. The ego ideal, which is like this kind of imaginary, almost authoritative figure in your mind, not an imaginary friend, but it's like, for whom are you performing whenever you're doing something and hoping to get acceptance? So like classic example is someone who everything that they do, both in school and work and everything, is to make their parents proud. I just want my parents to be proud of me. It's this kind of imaginary notion of your parents that you're trying to please in your head, that you're constantly performing. He calls that the ego ideal. Well, purity culture develops that with the future spouse. And so much of what you do in your life is to try to please this imaginary notion of the future spouse, who is like the most judgmental, merciless, awful human being that could possibly exist. And so, but it's this constant idea of like, if, like you said in the pledge, I can't do this because I made a pledge to my future spouse. That imaginary figure is now, but at least for me, to speak personally, it has affected like relationships for me, or at least like my engagement with other women, because it's hard to untangle the real people in the world from that like kind of ego ideal that I lived with for so many years, of like this constant fear of, if I'm not perfect, then this person is going to be horribly offended by me. They're going to reject me. They're going to see me as damaged goods. They're going to see me as, everything. And it has an effect on a lot of people.
And that's funny because it almost, I feel like this is universal in like secular thought, and dating is like the pressure of the man to live up to the woman's expectations, and the pressure of the woman to be like the ideal pedestal woman for the man. Like purity culture just creates that too. Like your imaginary future wife is this person that you have to be perfect for, and your imaginary future husband is someone that better be perfect for you because you've been waiting for him your whole life.
Yeah.
That's so bizarre. And just talking about it like that, the way it's an idolatry of somebody who,
of course,
may or may not exist. Like,
right.
We haven't even thought about that. Like, what person? Who are we talking about? We're talking about an imaginary, abstract future family that we know nothing about.
Yes, yes.
It's so strange. It's one of those things that I think we never questioned until now, because only now we're starting to see like the damage roll out.
Exactly, and it misses the opportunity to learn how to love people kind of where they are. Not that not encouraging bad behaviors or whatever, but we all have to learn how to meet people where they are in their life and learn how to love them and grow alongside of them. And purity culture does not allow for that at all, because you have to find someone else who's pure. And that just doesn't exist.
Right. And, speaking from a reform perspective, like that idea that like, well, I have to find somebody perfect and I'm going to be perfect. Like, well, you're setting yourself up for failure because that doesn't exist. It's nowhere. And I think Matt Chandler talked about, it was one of the first things I ever saw Matt Chandler talk about. He talked about a situation like that where he was in a college group and he had met a single mother who was in a kind of sordid relationship at the time anyway. And, his attitude was that he was like, well, this is where she is and I'm here, so I'm going to minister in this way. So, after a while, they finally warm up to the point where it's like, well, why don't you come with us to church? And she does. And he mentions how the minister, his sermon that day was about sex. And his analogy was to have a rose and hand it to the crowd and say, everybody pass it around. Everybody experience it. I want you to see how beautiful this thing is. And while they're doing that, he starts going into the fear-mongering part of purity culture, which is STDs and damaged goods and all of that stuff.
You have sex, you're going to die.
Right, exactly. Right. It's the Jack Chick method to purity. It was seen out of a hell house. So, he said the finish, the crescendo, the build to the sermon was he got his rose back, and obviously it's been through everybody's hands, so it's been broken and petals are gone and it's missing pieces. And he holds it up and he says, now who would want that? And, his attitude was like, you've just killed anybody who's coming in here already, thinking that they're that. You've given them no hope. You've given them no idea of redemption or restoration. You've just told them they're damaged forever and nobody wants them.
Yeah, it's awful. And I've seen that clip as well. You shared it. And I think it is a very powerful moment because his response is that Jesus wants the rose. Right. That's the whole point of the gospel. But I think it's important for us to take a little bit of time. Well, I don't want to dictate your show, but but to unpack that notion of these analogies, because this was a big part of purity culture, was the rose analogy. That was actually, I think, the only one that I ever heard. Was that, but they used it just in terms of like dating and getting your heart broken, and like they had this. They always. I have for those who don't know, anybody watching it, I collect VHS tapes. I especially like old Christian VHS tapes, and so I was going through and I was watching some old purity culture VHS tapes that I own. And one of the things that I noticed over and over again is they're always bringing up these poor little teenagers to be in their illustrations, to be like publicly embarrassed in front of all of their friends, which is just the worst shaming method, but it's highly effective for fear mongering. But, they're always bringing up, these teenagers to go through these examples. And maybe you heard some more than I have, but there's one where it's like everyone takes a bite out of a burger.
Oh man.
And you like take a bite out of a burger, pass it to your friend. And it's like, okay, nobody wants to keep eating this burger because it's all covered in spit and stuff. The rose one is very popular. Other analogies are like a chewed gum or like tape. That there's one where they bring up like teenage boys usually, and they put like masking tape on them, and then they rip it off, and then they keep they keep doing it, and then it like loses its ability to stick. There's another that I heard about where it's like you are everyone is asked to spit into this cup of water. Or
I think what this proves is that youth groups are disgusting.
yes, youth groups should be abolished. We just need to stop. But there's another one too that was like pouring dirt into water, and then like, does anybody want to drink this? And these are, of course, all just horrible analogies for sex and sexuality. It reinforces this idea that for women, they are, if you have sex before marriage, or in almost anything, if you do anything sexual before marriage, then you are like used and damaged goods. Right. You have ruined this gift that you will never be able to give to anyone else. You are now dirty water. Right. For men, if you look at the analogy, it's, you are intrinsically dirt. The man of the analogy, like, you are dirt, you are spit, you are this destructive force that selfishly devours other people intrinsically. And that is just, I think it was horribly damaging for so many people, both men and women. And it was especially damaging for people who are victims of sexual trauma as well, in any respect, because one of the consequences of experiencing sexual trauma is that one ends up viewing oneself as damaged goods, as like something within oneself has been intrinsically broken or damaged, which isn't true, but it is the kind of emotional gut reaction. And so then purity culture comes along and says, that's right, you are. And it's just absolutely horrible. And it, I think, just is the exact opposite of the gospel message, which is back to the analogy that you mentioned, which is that, Jesus wants the rose. And I don't want to go on too long pontificate. I have another example, but I'll let you chime in.
And I think there's, the reverse side of that is, I think there is a lot of potential for predatory male behavior if you know how to play the system, right? So
absolutely.
If you know how to present yourself as that ideal man, if you know how to be, the godly romantic, and then, maybe there is a girl who does think like, oh, this is, we've been dating for a while and he's been so sweet and romantic. Maybe it's not that big a deal if we do have sex before, if I do this for him, and then he gets it and he's out because you don't know him really, or you marry him because he did all these steps because that's what you're supposed to do to get a wife, and then you get married and you're two different people now because that was a facade. That wasn't really who you were. You're not interested in writing love poems every week, or you're not interested in, these big grand gestures, or maybe you didn't really ever care about prayer or the Bible, but when you were dating, you did, because that's what, a healthy couple does. And now the object of your faith is your spouse. And that's a faith that can't stand. And that's a marriage that can't stand.
Yeah. It leads to lots of, I've heard very horrible stories. It leads to lots of victim blaming as well. I heard a very terrible story of someone saying that this was in a YouTube video on someone who is an expert in dealing with trauma. And she was relaying her story about how her abuser was actually someone in the church, and they used all of these tactics of purity culture in order to shame her, of saying like, well, it's your fault for not dressing modestly. You're the one I can't help it, the way that God made me with this overactive, sex thing. And, I'm a sex demon, and it's up to you in order to dress modestly to not tempt me. And, it's your fault. And would use that type of manipulative victim blaming behavior.
Modesty is a whole other thing that, I want to do an episode about one day, but it's I don't know how to approach it from I
do think, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No. It's just one of those topics that I'm like, I don't know. Like, I honestly don't know. It's almost like, what's the quote about art or porn? Like, I can't define it, but you know what it is when you see it.
I suppose so. And purity culture had a lot to say about modesty. Most of it, I think, was very harmful. It taught women that their bodies are like intrinsically sinful, and any wrong actions of a man are their fault because they tempted them, even though they didn't try to, and they didn't realize it. There's a phrase like that was used, like stumbling blocks. You don't want your body to be stumbling in, and that was used a lot. And so
I really like to, I don't want to mean to interrupt you, but
go for it.
When the Apostle Paul talks about stumbling blocks, he's often talking about a thing that you were doing the Christian person, don't if your brother has a problem with their dietary laws, don't flaunt your ability to eat pork in front of him. So it's always like a responsibility on the person who maybe is being kind of libertine with their stuff. But here it's the other way around. It's like the vulnerable person is made to feel guilty. Like you're the stumbling block, not the other way around.
Yeah, it's total misuse of it. And there's also an interesting thing of like stumbling block is also applied to Christ himself.
Yes.
Like he's a stumbling block to the Jews and the Greeks. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer in his work Act and Being develops a whole theology of Christ as a stumbling block, and it's a very positive theology. So ladies, if someone ever calls you a stumbling block, take it as a compliment and be like, "Oh, I'm glad I'm being Christ-like. Thank you."
So because the phrase was "modest is hottest," right? That was the catchy slogan.
Which again is a fascinating thing because it conveys a sense of you still need to be attractive.
Yes,
it's just you need to do it under the rubric of modesty.
Man, that's a good angle that I had never considered before. It's like sneaky, subtle seduction. Like I'm going to seduce you with my purity, not with my outward display.
Yeah. And it reinforces the notion that like, a woman's greatest value is just to be the spectacle of beauty.
Yes.
And so it still objectifies them. It's just doing it in a different way. Yeah.
Which, I mean, that's the problem with, trying to overcorrect for whatever, purity culture, I think, is an overcorrection to free love culture. We're still in that hangover. The people who were writing the books for us when we were teenagers were people that were saved in the 70s and 80s that were coming off of that free love stuff.
Yeah.
So they're going completely the opposite way. And now, everybody in the wake is trying to like, okay, where did we go wrong? What are we supposed to be doing?
Yeah.
It's really hard to, I have a son. He's only 2. He's going to be 3. So right now I'm not, it's not a problem, but I know at some point he's going to be a teenager and he's going to be interested in girls and he's going to be an adult who marries or like, how do I navigate this for him? And it comes back to that idea of like, what is a biblical sexual ethic? And there's 1st and 2nd Corinthians talks a ton about sexual purity, and not even purity, but just conduct in that sense. That phrase porneia, sexual immorality comes up a lot. And there's even that verse in 2 Corinthians where it says there's sexual immorality that the world has never even heard of, and it talks about how somebody's sleeping with their father's wife, and it's just that rampant uncontrolled sexuality in the Corinthian church. So there is like a standard. The problem is I just think we don't have it. We've made up our own for whatever reason. Yeah.
And it's difficult. And I think part of it is just, like I mentioned before about a lot of the changing material socioeconomic conditions. Not that I'm not espousing relativism. I'm actually not a relativist when it comes to morality. That's not my view, but it does make things difficult because it's like, how do we take these moral principles and apply them to our own current circumstance whenever, the circumstances have changed a lot and you're encountering like new societies, new cultures, new everything that, we can't go back to like how marriage operated in biblical times, even if we wanted to. You're not going to be able to start doing arranged marriages again. I'm sorry. That is the one of the difficulties of it.
Right. And that's kind of the fear, right? Like the secular backlash is like the Handmaid's Tale idea that like, oh, if we have these biblical ideas that are outdated, we're going to have, female sex slaves and it's just going to be chaos. And like, that's also incorrect. And that's the difficulty in trying to like, one of the hard things is understanding that, like you said, the cultural difference. Like if we're going to take the scripture seriously, we have to understand that there is a book in the scripture. There's an epistle in the New Testament written to a slave owner. Like Philemon owned slaves. Like we just have to deal with that fact. And we have to deal with the fact that Paul did not rebuke him for owning a slave. And contrary to that, he sent his slave back to him so they can be reconciled. Like, culturally now we kind of like wince, but it's like, well, that's the text. Like, what do you want to do with it? You can't just throw it out. So we have to, how do we unpack this? What does it mean? How do we understand it? What did Roman slavery look like? What was their situation? Yeah. But it gets messier when we talk, now sexuality. No one's debating slavery now, but sexuality is something that, is.
Yeah, definitely. It is such a difficult question. Part of it, I think, is just acknowledging how difficult it is, approaching it with humility, kind of like what you're saying. I would suppose whenever I think about like teaching young people, I think one of the failures is also, I think, just a failure of the church in general and how we teach people, because we approach them. This is, I'm getting this from the philosopher James K.A. Smith. If anybody wants, he's actually he teaches at Calvin College.
Nice.
He's Reformed. You might like him.
All right, here we go. My guy.
But, yeah. There we go. He's great though. And his whole thing that he's pointing out is that churches approach people as primarily thinking things, and they don't interact with people at the level of like desire, imagination, perception, character, virtues, habits, and how those things get instilled into us. It's primarily just like give them some information, tell them what to do, and then expect them to do it. And I don't think that like young people, to a certain extent, yes, but they don't simply need to think better about sex. They also need to cultivate the desires and habits towards a healthy sexual imagination and a healthy sexual expression and like a healthy sexuality. And they need to be led in the type of practices and, as James K. Smith says, liturgical actions that help foster that character building and help foster those habits in accordance with that end that I talked about earlier about being, united in a type of sacred form of love and friendship and everything.
That's funny because I heard two different things today, kind of in that vein, about totally different topics. One of them was about apologetics, actually. This I don't know if you're familiar with Cy Ten Bruggencate. He's a Canadian apologist. He was talking about how the turning point for apologetics for him was when he realized that nobody's a machine who just analyzes facts. You analyze your facts in terms of how you feel about them.
Of course,
so that was like a switch for him. Like, oh, the problem's not the facts that I'm giving you. The problem is how you feel about the facts that I'm giving you.
Right. Yes.
And another one is Professor Bruce Gore, who, if anyone's interested in like church history, he's got a whole series that he did on YouTube. I was watching his Revelation one; it's really good. But one of the things he talks about is that idea that like, okay, how you feel can be determined by what you do. So, for instance, doing the thing cultivates the feeling more than feeling motivates you to do the thing, right? Like, especially it's talking from a creative standpoint. For me personally, it's like I don't feel like painting today. Okay, well, if I wait till I feel like painting to paint, I'm never going to paint anything. So I got to start doing the thing, and I'll get the rhythm, and I'll get the flow, and I'll get the feeling.
Yeah, and I think that's the importance of, and this is what James K. Smith's argument is that's the importance of like liturgy within the church, and by that he means like in general that liturgy means like the work of the people, what you're doing in a church service, and it's important to have like a robust sense of these Christian practices because a lot of times you have to be doing things before you start. It starts really becoming a habit and second nature for you. You have to learn how to, love your neighbor as yourself by doing, loving things towards them. And we often don't want to, but it's something that you kind of have to pick up.
Speaking of liturgy, just because of the season we're in, I'm curious your opinion about things like Lent. I feel like Protestants have an unnecessarily negative attitude towards Lent. Especially I saw one person who's semi-popular on social media talking about how, it's a Catholic idea, it's extra biblical, so we shouldn't have anything to do with so is Advent, but we still do that and nobody has a problem with that. What's like the Methodist attitude on Lent? Do you guys participate?
Methodists love Lent. Okay. that is like one of the weird things that like not weird. So like Methodism is born out of like Charles Wesley is John Wesley is the OG Methodist, and he was originally part of the Church of England, which the Church of England, that's like the Anglicans and the Episcopal Church and all that kind of stuff. Very liturgical, very influenced by, the lectionary calendar and these different seasons and Lent and everything. So John Wesley was super into that kind of stuff. And he ended up more as like an evangelist and stuff, but that is one of the things that we've held on to in our tradition is a love of of Lent. They just love it.
One of the families in our church was talking about how they're trying to incorporate kind of a Lent practice, not necessarily the whole thing. Cause I grew in South Texas. It's a very Catholic area. So you have that, on Ash Wednesday, everybody has it. You just see them walking around with the crosses. it's kind of one of those weird things. And now being older and kind of looking into, what is this and why do you do this, and talking to Catholic people, I'm like, okay, why do you do this? What are you fasting from? Do you understand the concept? And I feel like for a lot of them, it is cultural, where it's like, well, this is just what you do. But I mean, that's true of any congregation or denomination. There's a lot of people that are so I don't know. I think, part of that is that we have lost an idea of like a liturgical duty, like a thing that we do to stir up affection, which, kind of speaking on marriage, like we've thought of marriage in kind of the romantic sense. And I love the romantics, but they kind of ruined everything. Because it's all feeling and emotion and, stirred up by everything. And, you probably know a lot about the romantic movement, I would assume, and the philosophy behind it, but it was kind of a backlash against naturalism, right? Like naturalism said, or, the Enlightenment said, there is no God. We can explain all of this rationally. All of these feelings and what they don't actually mean anything. It's all science. We can explain that. The romantics just could not deal with that. They were like, no, this has to mean something. And if there's nothing beyond the thing, then the thing itself must be the thing. So that's where you have this, like, everything is romantic. Nature is romantic, and death is romantic, and life is romantic, and relationships and everything. And you get people like Byron and Shelley who are just over the top, and Keats and everybody like that. But I think we adopted their ethos for relationships, because that's the only thing we really call romantic anymore, right? Like we don't talk about sunsets as being romantic, or it's all relationships.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, in some sense, we think of our marriages and our love lives like that, like it's this deep burning desire. And, it's fun. That feeling, that new crush feeling, that new infatuation is great. Like you love it, but it fades. And when you've been married for a while and it fades, that's when you start to think like, maybe I married the wrong person. Maybe I don't know what I'm doing. And, thankfully, I think there's people like Vodi Balcom and John Piper who talk about like, do the things that you do for somebody you love. Like love is an action. Decide every day to love somebody in your marriage. Like you said, loving your enemies is the same attitude. Love them and you will love them. Not wait till you feel like it.
Yeah. I think you're making a good point that you see people, and again, we point this out in purity culture. You have all these people who are going to these crazy extremes. Right. And sometimes there's like a kernel of truth within it, like the Enlightenment, not to sound like I'm nitpicking here, they actually did believe in God, many of them. And in some circumstances, they saw like, oh, we're just, talking about, pointing out the way that God has created the earth. And, we're doing that through science and reason and everything. And there's some truth to that, like, a world that you can discover and know about that was created by someone, there's some truth to that. The Romantics talking about like, no, there, it's beauty and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, like I want to agree with that. This stuff is really beautiful. Life is full of beauty, and I don't want to discourage that. But it's kind of like they end up going into this is the only thing, and then like you see in romantic relationships of like, it's just the foundation of it is, these strong feelings and these emotions that you feel for someone. It's kind of like, well, emotions are definitely part of all human relationships, but it's also not the only thing that's involved. And it's because emotions are going to fluctuate a little bit. It's also involved of, how you treat each other and the habits that you've developed in relating to that person and everything. So yeah, it's kind of like, maybe the lesson for today is learn to develop some nuance in your life. If you find yourself in an all or nothing type of mentality,
you probably made a mistake.
Yes.
It's tied together, I guess, because I love that idea of ethics and aesthetics are tied together. Like we appreciate them in the same way, because emotion and rationality apart from each other are faulty, right? Like they have to be together. Because I think, as a Reformed person, that's one of the things that I worry about is that we have kind of a void of emotion, right? It becomes this head thing, like this deep head knowledge. And I've talked to other Reformed people about it, and we've lamented it because, like, if you read the Reformers, if you read Luther, you read Calvin, they were very emotional and talk about passions and feeling, and even the Puritans, who are like the American joke of like the stodgy all black Puritans. they talk about godly affections. Like it's a thing we feel. Yeah. And even in the scriptures, they talk about that, stirred up with love for each other and love for God and love for everything. Yeah. And purity culture has kind of damaged that aspect of it. The romanticism that is important. It's not the focus, but it does matter. It's like it's treated as a dirty feeling.
Yeah. And I agree. Yeah. There's definitely, being able to kind of recognize how these things are interrelated, yes. And strengthened by one another. I think that's a great point.
Do you think, this is getting off topic a little bit, but do you think the attitude of like not being able to appreciate that emotionalism is also why we can't, as a Christian community, appreciate artistic endeavors anymore or make them?
Yeah, probably. I mean, what's the point of making a painting? Just listen to the sermon, that type of attitude. Yeah, I think that is definitely a problem. People don't really appreciate or understand the unique ways that art is capable of communicating theology.
That's interesting. So I was thinking about this myself this week, thinking about music, because music is big. For me, I'm a fan of a lot of bands and I really dig into stuff. And just thinking about how I don't want to say like there was a very cheesy tendency in the 90s and 2000s to take any movie or song or whatever and put a Christian spin on it. Like, what gospel lesson can we learn from The Matrix? Like, well,
I love it.
Realistically, nothing. I kind of get where you're going with it, but kind of just thinking about how music in general, my favorite band, My Chemical Romance, wrote a ton of songs that have no religious meaning or background or anything to them. But when I listen to them, it stirs up those thoughts in my head because that's the angle I'm coming from, right? So when I hear, when I hear something like, I'm not afraid to keep on living, I'm not afraid to walk this world alone, like my thought is not the same as somebody who's maybe coming from an atheistic perspective or a Buddhist perspective. Like I have this Christian worldview that I'm looking through that kind of stirs up a different attitude. And I think I'm trying not to get lost on this tangent, but I think that it's a shame that atheistic people, non-Christian people, whatever you want to call it, can write songs about deep emotional truths and we cannot, or we just don't.
Yeah, I think it's really, really a weird, it's so weird. You see that trend all the time, like that you look at the work that certain non-Christians are doing. I don't mean to, get too mad that they're non-Christian, but like, it's this great work. And then it's like, you look at what Christians are doing the same time period. And it's like, oh no. Like some of the great, like, I think I'm probably not pronouncing this right, but it's called, I think aleatoricism, which is like the incorporation of chants into your music. Okay. Like John Cage and things like that. And people, some like were doing it from at least a non-theistic perspective. So I don't know if they were still religious in other respects, right. Buddhism or something, but incorporate, the world being, chaos and trying to bring attention to the notion of chants within music and the notion of the environment around you that you're creating the music, influencing the song itself. And I'm always, my biggest regret is that no Christian during that time was like, oh, okay, so I'm going to go like perform out in nature creation and say like, oh yeah, God's creation is also part of my song now. Right. Like the chance of like incorporating, the beauty of the world that God has created into your song. I was so mad that no Christian did that. There's a soundtrack that sounds like I don't know if you've ever seen the Martin Scorsese movie Silence, but the soundtrack to that.
Oh, you know what? No, I've been meaning to watch that and I haven't.
It's good.
That's a really interesting movie. When I saw like, I forget the guy's name, but a Christian guy that does kind of culture analysis talking about that movie. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting. I really want to watch it.
It's really good movie. Yeah.
There's that kind of reminds me, again, a little off topic, but I heard a story about my favorite song, Heroes by David Bowie. Mm-hmm. At the kind of towards the end where he just has the kind of that guttural scream and it just sounds kind of off, but it works when he's singing at the end of the song, we could be heroes. And it just sounds kind of,
okay. Yeah.
So he had a series of microphones set up certain distances apart, and each one would only trigger when the sound was loud enough to hit them.
Ooh.
So he was kind of doing that chaotic, like, if I
Yeah,
can hit it,
yeah.
it'll catch. If I can't hit it, it won't. And we'll see what comes out at the end. And I just thought, man, that's really interesting. And like you're saying, Christian art is really sterile and like clean.
Doesn't
and
experiment at all. Doesn't try to,
man. And you know, our relationships are kind of like that too, kind of sterile. And
yeah.
I don't know, that we're very unromantic, if that's okay to say.
Yeah. I think romanticism is needed. I think it's, it's important to involve the emotions, to pay attention to your partner's emotional needs and things like that. All of those, all of those things are vitally important. And purity culture especially neglected that because it just so focused on sex. It didn't, it never taught you how to, like as a man, or, it never taught me how to be sensitive to the emotional needs of a woman. It was something that I had to learn from, the other people. Thankfully, my mom was, helpful at, educating me and making up for that lack of education, because my mom is really good at things like that. But yeah, it just portrays people as like sex machines and completely neglecting, these other aspects of relationships that are really important to know. And I do think it's interesting also, even in like how they taught about sex, for the most part, people that grew up in purity culture, especially if you were like myself, raised in a private school, you basically received no sex education. Beyond don't do it. And beyond like, men make sperm, women make eggs, put it together and you get a baby.
If that.
And and that was like the only, education that we were given. And then it was just tons of information about how, like, if you have premarital sex, you'll die and Jesus will stop loving you. And so I do think, like, back to the topic that we were talking about earlier, I do think people need to have a much more robust sexual education. And churches need to be willing to support that on just understanding all the different, just scientific information about sex. I think like that's really, really important, because you get, in some circumstances, there were people who were so deprived of sexual education that they'd get into a marriage and they wouldn't be able to even name like anatomical parts of the human body. And it's like, you need to be able to know that kind of stuff. It's just vital for people to know. So I do think that's an important thing.
Well, it's kind of weird that, especially for Christians who are so into the idea of like design and creation and intelligent design, like we're designed with genitalia. Like it's not incidental that we have them, but we treat it like that's, this appendage that we wish we could get rid of, or, this function that we wish it. I feel like some Christians would be super cool if we could figure out how to grow a baby in an incubation tube and never have to have physical contact of any kind. And just, that's how we come out clean and sterile.
Yeah. Which is unfortunate. And I think that part of that too is within that type of shaming certain parts of our body, we like, can reinforce this notion of like, that's something about yourself that you should be humiliated about, or that you should be ashamed of. And I think it can generate a lot of like self-shame or like self-insecurity, because, you'll look at not you, but, people will look at, people will look at certain parts of their body and be like ashamed of them, or like view it as a threat. There's a wonderful book by Linda K. Klein called Pure, which is just her dismantling the legacy of purity culture and recording tons of testimonies by these women who grew up in it. It's a great resource if anybody wants to look it up. And she records these stories about these women who would have anxiety attacks looking at their own bodies in the mirror. Like I'm about to cry even just thinking about that. But I've like personally had those experiences as well, of like, being so shamed by my own body that, from purity culture, that I end up, hating myself. And I think the opposite attitude that God wants us to have to our bodies. I think that, we need to be able to love and cherish ourselves and recognize that I think people will be much more willing to express Christian love to other people if they think that they have something worthwhile giving to others, and I think that people need to be taught that.
That gets into, I want to bring this up because I saw it pop up and it's interesting. When you talk about something worthwhile to give to others, one of the things that I've talked about is that there's no good Christian love songs. And there is this one that I do remember because it was like a radio hit on Christian radio. It was called Waiting for You by this Australian, I think she was, artist named Rebecca St. James. And that was the whole point of the song. I think the chorus was, I'm waiting for you, wait for me too. And that's what it's about. That's, this is the greatest love that I can give you is my purity. And it's like, there's no good Christian love songs.
Yeah, that's terrible. And especially like coming back to it from like, on like the notion of trauma and people who have been abused, like that just really reinforces this notion of like, I mean, they didn't even make that choice for themselves. Right. If one is abused, then, that was something done to them. And, that opportunity or, and so it's almost like saying like, you don't have anything good to give, right. Which is what one of the core fears of many trauma victims is that like, I'm damaged goods and I don't have anything to, worthwhile to give to other people, which is not true. I mean, that, contradicts, everything that we might say about God's grace and how God, transforms us and works within us to be able to express godly love to other people. Right. But it's like purity culture comes in and is like trying to affirm, the false narratives of trauma in that respect.
Right. And, I've known people who have been through those kind of experiences, and it is always that, we've talked about like, oh, well, I'm interested in this person, but I don't know how to tell them about my baggage. And it's like, well, yeah, I think there's a trust and understanding that has to come with that they'll be understanding and delicate of what you're dealing with. And I don't think maybe that's why it doesn't get talked about in the church, because there's a fear that there is no understanding or gentleness to be dealt with.
Yeah, unfortunately, the church has really neglected this, which is such a shame because one of the biggest scandals happening in churches right now is around sexual abuse, not just in the Catholic Church, it's in lots of denominations. Yep. Churches absolutely need to start having a more robust education and understanding of sexual abuse and sexual trauma and things like that. But yeah, in terms of, talking to other people about one's trauma, how to do that, when to do that. There is, I'll recommend to you to recommend things on your show that I don't, but there's I won't, don't take this as Julian recommended. This is Vacation Bible School, the YouTube
thoughts
channel.
And opinions expressed by Vacation Bible School do not necessarily reflect those of the time and place.
Thank you. Yes. No, I mean, it's not, I don't think it's problematic. I just, but there is a great YouTube channel called Trauma Talk, who, and she, is someone who's gone through these things, and she talks a lot about questions of how do you talk to your partner about your trauma? How can you as a partner listen to that person's trauma and be there to support them and everything? And so it's a lot of great material. So I'd highly recommend checking that out. It's called Trauma Talk. So, that's another place that you can go to if one desires further education on that.
And I talked about this, not this specifically, but with one of my pastors, we were talking about, we did a video a couple of months ago about discipleship. And I asked him about the tension between being a lead pastor and also being accountable. And I think when we talk about these kind of, sex scandals in the church, that's one of the problems is that nobody was accountable.
Absolutely.
And it especially happens in, sadly, I think a lot in Protestant groups, because we don't have I'm blanking on the word now. We don't have a
broader system of like bishops and checks and balances.
We don't have a structure where nobody's above anybody. It's the lead pastor and he's the man. And that's a congregational, which being a Baptist, that's kind of the system I grew up in. But there was nobody above them.
Right.
And in the Catholic Church, it gets really, really kind of gross because the people that were above them were just kind of helping hide it.
Yeah. That's one of what makes it so worse is that like there's so many opportunities for it to be stopped, and it was just failure almost every step of the way.
I didn't plan on talking about this, but it happened, so I mean, we might as well.
Sure.
Robbie Zacharias, who just passed away, and all that stuff is kind of come out. Dr. James White was kind of giving his statement on it, and he was talking about how there's a lot of anomalies, like the money that was going out. Like, why was nobody keeping track of this and asking what it was for? And the fact that Ravi would be gone out of country by himself. Like, why was nobody questioning that or asking what was going on? Or there were so many opportunities to where somebody should have been able to say, hey, what is this? And nobody did. And, I don't like to speculate on what somebody's eternal state is, because I don't know and I can't say for certain, but there's evidence that these kind of text messages and emails and videos or whatever were being exchanged months before he died, and there was no evidence of any kind of repentance, but rather him using his power and influence to cover it up and suppress it. And now we're all dealing with the wake of that. Like, the ministry's dead. Like, what are you going to do? There's no salvaging that. Yeah.
I think that's one of that story, of course, is just so sad and horrific. And I think that you're bringing up such a good point of like the lack of accountability within many of these places. I mean, in his ministry, it's the Ravi Zacharias ministry, it's all him. He's the man. He's, the leader of this. Who is going to hold him accountable? So I do think that we need to try to find ways to build accountability into our churches in whatever way that we can. Like, I think one of the problems, actually, I know I made a joke earlier about abolish youth groups, but I do think one of the problems is that in youth groups, you have all of these very impressionable middle school to high schoolers put under the care of like one youth pastor that maybe has a Bible degree. We used to joke, like I've joked with other people, like, what are you going to do? I don't know, maybe drop out of college and be a youth pastor. But like, unfortunately, that type of mentality is very common. You have these very inexperienced people that are put in charge of a bunch of vulnerable, underaged kids with very little accountability. I mean, they're just like in charge of this service. And I think that's really problematic. And I think that, churches should start considering alternative models to youth ministry, especially considering like how much abuse happens within youth ministry.
I mean, just my youth group was pretty good. We had pretty good oversight, but my youth pastors were like in their 20s. They were young guys. Like, I feel like that's the typical youth pastor, is a young, charismatic guy in charge of like young, impressionable girls. Like, you're setting yourself up, like,
and boys as well. I have talked to someone before who was sexually abused by his youth pastor. It's just, and it messed him up for a long time. He's back living a great life now. Shows how amazing God's grace is, and being able to help bring redemption to people. But it's playing with fire.
Right. And that's one of the things too that I think the Bible does talk so much about the problem of lust and the problem of sexual immorality and the problem of not controlling that or indulging in that. And maybe we just don't take it seriously. Maybe sometimes we think we're above. I know personally, I found myself in situations where I thought, well, I can handle this. Obviously, I am above this kind of thing. And then you're in the midst of it, like, I could not handle this. I thought I could, and that I don't think that we have an elevated view of clergy to where we think like, well, they're pious, they can handle, and they can't. They're just like us.
Right.
So maybe to end on this, one of the things, and then we'll get some plugs before we go. One of the things that I really bothered me about purity culture is this idea that I think purity is like a code word for holiness. And it becomes kind of this self-willed holiness. Like, if you can control yourself and you can monitor this and you can do this, then you'll be pure. that idea is just really, really irritating to me on a lot of levels. I made the comment this week that holiness is a requirement and a consequence of salvation. The requirement for salvation is holiness, and that holiness comes from Christ and his life that he lived. The consequence of holiness is then put on us after salvation, that conforming of the Holy Spirit to conform us to the image of Christ. We become drawn to holiness. It's and maybe we'll have different theological perspectives on this, but it's not this innate holiness that I possess, but it's this put on holiness from God that elevates us to that position.
Yeah.
I think, we lose that in the scriptures, especially when talking to people who have been through some kind of abuse and this purity culture that maybe makes them feel less than or less whole than. I would encourage to hold on to that perspective that the apostles give when Paul says, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed away. All things are new, right? In Revelation specifically, because we're in Revelation this week, so the thought's fresh in my head. Jesus talking about, I am making all things new. Like whatever trauma, whatever baggage you have, it's all new. And that, in Revelation, to get back to holiness, that idea when John sees the multitude dressed in white robes, their white robes are white because they were dipped in the blood of Christ, not because they were in the self-will or the self-motivated perfectionism of whatever culture or belief system they had. It always comes back to that. So, encourage people. Your holiness is not found in yourself. Your holiness as your identity, as all other aspects of your life, is found in Christ and his work and his completeness and his wholeness. So hopefully that helps.
I totally agree. And I think that, like you're saying, many people were like that notion of holiness. It creates a type of spiritual elitism that's all up to you, and like only the most pure are the ones that are loved the most by Jesus.
Right.
And I think that personally, like if I were to ask who's the most sexually pure, I'd say that the most sexually pure in Jesus's eyes is not the virgin or the man who doesn't lust, but the one who is dealing with trauma from sexual abuse. I think that those are the people who are most like pure and precious in God's sight. That those are the people who God is drawn to and wanting to redeem and transform and make all things new, like what you said.
Awesome. So before we take off, I didn't ask you before, so I hope I'm not putting you on the spot. But you have any products, any plugs, anything, any projects you're working on right now?
I'm working on an album for a friend's record label. I think it's called Junk Maker Sounds on Bandcamp. And I have been way too slow at getting that out because I have I'm a grad student, and so I've been in school. This has just been a killer semester, and have not been had enough time to work on it. But Junk Maker, sorry to correct you.
Okay, I thought about that. I was like, was it jump or junk?
Sorry. At least I hope so. Maybe I'm saying it completely wrong, and who knows? We'll find it eventually. I can post the link in the Facebook or whatever. But so that'll come out sometime. It'll be there sometime.
What's the subject you're working with? Or does it have a theme, or is it more of just kind of a free form album?
I'm hoping that a theme will emerge. We're gonna see what emerges. There is, I think, so far a coherence in the sound. I just can't exactly decipher what that sound is.
Okay, cool. We'll be interested to hear that. I'm always impressed by what you put out. The Satanic Panic one still is like that one you have of the stage play with the puppets and the stuff that's in there. That clip that's part of the visual album. It's like, it scares me, but I can't not watch it because it's so like.
Thank you.
Just to end on a musical note too. I don't know if you were in mourning this week as Daft Punk broke up, but I had to take a personal day.
Very, very unfortunate. Their album Random Access Memories is just one of my favorites. Absolutely adore that album. Very sad to see them go.
That album has to predate Vaporwave, right?
I don't think it does. When did it come out? Like 2014?
I want to say it was, I can look it up right now because we're sitting in front of a computer. I felt like it was 2012, but I could be wrong. Let me.
Okay, if it was 2012, then it came out like right around the same time.
Let's see. 2013 it came out.
Okay, yeah. Most people link the creation of Vaporwave to around 2012, 2013.
Okay. So I wonder if that was
Although
just like
it might actually go back all the way to MF Doom. He was the first to truly make like a sampled vaporwave type sound on one of his albums. So there's some debate on that.
I wonder if that was just like a general creative thing that was floating in the air, or if
Maybe
there's a crossover between the two, like influence. Because I used to think like, oh, this is a disco album. Is it a disco album or is it a vaporwave album? Because like now Rodgers is on it, but it's also like at the time vaporwave and that kind of stuff was in the air. So I don't know.
Yeah, I'm sure random access memory especially influenced the development of future funk, which is considered a type of vaporwave subgenre. So yeah, I think that, all of that is in the water at the same time.
So RIP to Daft Punk. Watch Tron Legacy if you haven't, because it's a cool movie with a cool soundtrack. But thanks for coming on with us, man, this week, especially with Solomon being out. I appreciate you filling in.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a joy.
I hope it was edifying to anybody. If you guys have comments, please leave them in. And if you are struggling with anything, there is real resources to reach out to. Don't feel like, if you feel like there's no answers, there is. So don't bring that despair on yourself and live in that, because it's just destructive. There is newness of life to walk in.
Absolutely.
Until next time, this is the time, this is the place. We'll see you next week, hopefully with Solomon. So peace.